My mother died from a drug overdose, and I never met my father. By the time I was 10, the state sent me to foster care. That's how I ended up in a house on the edge of the city, run by a woman named Mona. She was in her late 40s and had 5 kids under her roof, counting me. Her boyfriend Marco came around a lot. I never liked him. He had a rough face and a scar on his cheek that looked like it came from a knife fight. There was something about the way he stared down at the floor that made my skin crawl. I remember thinking that maybe this house would be different. But sometimes the worst things hide behind locked doors and wallpaper. Mona's house was strange from the start. When the social worker dropped me off, I just had a plastic bag with my name on it and a toothbrush. She didn't say much, barely looked at me, and when she left, she handed Mona a thick envelope and drove off without a word. I stood there on the porch, looking at the chipped marigold pots under the window, the patchy grass, and the 2 ladybug stickers on the porch light. The house looked fine from the outside, almost like any other on the street, but something about it felt off. The kind of place where you could almost convince yourself everything was normal if you didn't look too closely. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cleaning spray and boiled vegetables. There was a crowded shoe rack by the door, mismatched sneakers spilling over, a faded brown carpet worn thin in spots, and high up on the wall, a row of colorful handprints. Most of the furniture looked like it had been dragged in from someone else's living room. Mona led me down a narrow hall to my room at the end. The door didn't lock. The window looked straight into the neighbor's fence, barely a foot away. There was a small bed and a low dresser. When I opened the top drawer, it stuck halfway. Someone had scratched the name Anna into the wood. Later, Maria would tell me Anna used to sleep in this room before me. I met Maria that first afternoon. She was about my age, with dark hair always pulled tight in a ponytail. She didn't talk much, just watched me like she was sizing me up. The other kids were younger, too busy with their coloring books to notice me. At dinner, Mona made macaroni and canned peas. We all sat together at the table. Marco came stomping in halfway through, dropping his tool belt with a heavy thud. He barely glanced at Mona, but he stared at me for a long time before sitting down. He chomped through grisly stories of his old job at the slaughterhouse, as if testing which of us could stomach it. Mona kept putting food on my plate even when I shook my head. "You're too skinny," she said, pressing down another scoop of ham. The other kids barely touched their food. I started to notice Mona watching me more than the others. She'd pass my room for no reason, pretending to look for something, but her eyes were always on me. At first, I thought she was just strict, but there was something else, like she was waiting for me to slip up. I tried to keep quiet and stay out of the way, but it didn't matter. She hovered, tense and expectant. The basement door was at the end of the hall, painted the same dull color as the walls. Everyone avoided that door. Maria whispered it was always locked after dinner, like Mona was hiding something down there. Marco spent most of his time in the basement, coming up only to eat or grab another tool. If I got too close to the door, Mona would call my name, her voice sharp. Once, Marco caught me glancing at the stairs and just stared until I looked away. Maria pulled me aside later and told me, "Don't ask about the basement. It's not safe." She said it quietly, her eyes darting to the hallway. It didn't sound like a warning about a broken step or bad wiring. It sounded like she was talking about something alive. At night, the house changed. The footsteps overhead weren't the usual creaks and groans. They were heavy, steady, stopping right above my bed. Sometimes I'd lie there, counting the seconds of silence, hoping it was just Mona or Marco moving around. Once, I heard breathing through the vent, slow, ragged, not like anyone sleeping. I tried to tell myself it was just the pipes, but I didn't really believe it. When I asked Mona about it, she just shrugged. "Houses like this settle," she said. But I knew houses didn't breathe. Mona's bedroom was at the front of the house, door always closed. I only saw inside once when she called me to help carry laundry. The wallpaper in there was wrong. Instead of flowers or stripes, it was patched together in odd shapes like a puzzle where none of the pieces fit. The colors didn't match. Some spots felt rough, others almost slick. Sometimes the edges curled up, and if anyone even looked like they might touch them, Mona would snap. "Leave that alone. That's nothing for you to worry about." Her hands shook as she pressed the paper back into place. Marco barely spoke to any of us. He'd come up from the basement, wiping his hands on his pants, stare at the kids for a second, then disappear outside to smoke. Sometimes, I'd catch him watching me from the bottom of the stairs, his face flat but his eyes following every move I made. Once, when I got too close to the basement door, he said, "You don't want to see what's down there," and gave a smile that wasn't really a smile at all. The other kids kept to themselves. Maria was the only one who talked to me, and even then, only in whispers. She told me Anna used to sleep in my room, but she was gone now. She didn't say where Anna went. Whenever I asked about the basement, Maria would just shake her head and go back to coloring. Every night after dinner, Marco would lock the basement door. I started to wonder what was really down there and why everyone pretended not to notice. One day, I found a rusty key taped under my bed frame, wrapped in brittle masking tape. I almost put it back, but something made me keep it. I didn't tell anyone, not even Maria. The key felt cold and heavy in my pocket. I started paying attention to the little things, the way the doors rattled in the hallway but never opened, the greasy feel of the handles, the different smells in every room. It was like the house was full of secrets and nobody wanted to talk about them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, listening to the breathing through the vent, the footsteps that never seemed to go away. I gripped the key in my fist, telling myself it was just for emergencies. But I knew better. I could feel something waiting, just out of sight, pressing in from behind the walls. I tried not to think about it, but the harder I tried, the more I noticed the little noises, the strange patterns in the wallpaper, the way the house seemed to listen. I didn't know it yet, but things were about to get even stranger. The first time I heard the whisper, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to count the seconds until morning. The house was quiet in that way old houses get at night, too still, like it was waiting for something. That's when it started. A woman's voice, soft and shaky, whispering, "Help me, please." I sat up so fast my heart thudded in my chest. I listened, holding my breath, but nothing else came through. I knew Mona never watched TV past 9, so it had to be something else. The next night, it happened again. The same words, a little louder, like the voice was pushing against the wall to get to me. "Help me, please." I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to convince myself I was just tired or jumpy, but the voice was there, clear as anything. It didn't sound like the pipes or the wind or anything you could explain away. It sounded desperate. At breakfast, I nudged Maria and whispered, "Do you ever hear anything weird at night?" She stared at her cereal for a long time before answering. "Sometimes I hear a lady crying, but don't talk about it." That was all she'd say. She didn't look at me again. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. I started watching Mona more closely, especially at night. Her bedroom was down the hall from mine, and the wallpaper in there was impossible to ignore. Up close, it was a mess. flowers and butterflies, but the pieces didn't match, like someone had patched it together from scraps. Some spots looked smooth, almost shiny, and others were rough and peeling at the edges. I found myself staring at it whenever I walked by, looking for the spot where the voice might be coming from. One night I stood outside Mona's room just to see if I could hear anything. The wallpaper looked worse in the dim hallway light. I reached out to touch a loose edge, and before I could do anything, Mona's voice shot out, "Leave it alone." I looked over and saw her standing in the doorway, her hands shaking as she smoothed the paper down. She didn't say anything else. She just pressed her palm against the wall and waited for me to leave. After that, Marco started locking the basement up tighter. I heard the sound of a chain dragging across the door, and one afternoon I watched him struggle with a heavy trunk, hauling it down the stairs. He caught me watching and just stared, not saying anything at first. "Some things are better left alone," he finally said, voice flat. He turned the key in the lock 3 times, then walked past me like I wasn't even there. What could Marco be hiding down there? I kept that question burning in the back of my mind all week. Back in my room, the whisper got worse. Some nights it was just the words, soft and pleading. Other times it sounded like crying, wet, broken sobs tangled up with, "Help me, please." I pressed my ear to the wall and heard scratching, a faint dragging sound, like nails scraping across wood. It was too close. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but I knew it wasn't. I lay awake, picturing a woman trapped behind the wall, her fingers bloody from clawing at the plaster. I started carrying the key I'd found everywhere, wrapped in tape so nobody would see. It made me feel a little safer, even though I had no idea what it opened. I got better at sneaking around, waiting for moments when Mona and Marco weren't watching. One Sunday, when I thought Mona had gone out, I slipped into her room. The wallpaper looked even worse in the daylight. Colors smeared together, nothing matching, edges curling up. Near the dresser I found a spot where one piece was already lifting. I reached out and touched it. There was a sticky residue underneath, and when I pulled gently, I saw something dark and rough beneath the paper. It wasn't drywall or plaster. It felt wrong, and the color was off. My stomach twisted and I stepped back fast. After that, I started having nightmares. I dreamed about people trapped behind walls, their mouths sewn shut, scratching until their fingers bled. In the dreams, Mona and Marco watched, their faces melting and shifting, never looking quite human. I'd wake up sweating, the whisper still echoing in my ears. Maria told me to leave it alone, but she couldn't say why. She just looked scared. The less she said, the more I wanted to know. The voice didn't stop. Some nights it faded, but other times it pressed in so close it felt like it was inside my head. I counted the minutes until dawn, wishing it would go quiet. One night I saw Mona and Marco arguing in the kitchen. Marco kept glancing at the stairs. Mona shook her head, covering her mouth. I caught 2 words: get rid. After that, Mona's hands shook all the time, even when she poured coffee. Marco stopped pretending to be friendly. He barely looked at me, but when he did, I felt like he was sizing me up for something I didn't want to think about. I couldn't leave it alone anymore. I waited until the house was dark and everyone was asleep. I crept into Mona's room, found the loose piece of wallpaper and pulled. It tore with a soft ripping sound. Underneath I saw flesh, not animal, not fake. Real human skin patched together, dotted with hair and scars grafted onto the wall. I froze. The whisper stopped. The room went silent, heavy, like the house was holding its breath. After that, I couldn't look at wallpaper without my hands shaking. I didn't want to sleep. I kept watch at the window, listening for footsteps in the hall. I knew the house was hiding more than I'd seen, and that whatever was behind the walls wasn't finished with me yet. The day I ended up in the basement, it was because Mona needed a wrench and Marco was busy outside fixing the fence. She called down the hall, annoyed, and asked me to get it for her. I'd secretly kept the basement key since the day the pipe under the kitchen sink started leaking and Marco left it out by mistake. I never said anything about it, just slipped it into my pocket and waited. Now, I had a reason to use it that wouldn't make anyone suspicious. I told Maria to keep an eye out. She nodded and leaned against the wall at the top of the stairs, pretending to read a comic. The basement door was heavier than it looked, and the air behind it felt cold and stale. The key clicked in the lock, and I slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind me. The steps creaked with every move. The light bulb overhead buzzed and flickered, barely bright enough to see more than shadows at first. Down there, the air was thick with that funky chemical smell, bleach and something sour. There were boxes stacked against the walls, some with kids' names written on masking tape, some with nothing at all. A couple of the boxes looked like they'd been taped shut for years. There was an old ping-pong table folded up near the back, and next to it the trunk. It was big and square, copper-colored, with a heavy metal lock. I didn't even try my key on it. Just looking at the trunk made my stomach lurch. This wasn't cardboard or wood. It felt alive, like something inside was waiting. I turned away and started looking for the wrench. There was a tool bench with drawers that stuck, and a metal filing cabinet wedged underneath. I tried my key in the cabinet. It turned after a bit of a fight, and the drawer slid open with a screech. Inside, there were stacks of old photos, curled and yellowed at the edges. The first one was a little girl with a birthday cake, her eyes wide and scared. There were others, kids standing in front of houses, some of them looking straight into the camera, none of them smiling. I flipped through the pile and my hands started to shake. Under the photos, I found a thin, spiral-bound notebook. I opened it and saw names, addresses, and dates written in blue pen. Some of the names I recognized from upstairs, Anna for one. Next to some of the entries, the word wallpaper was circled in Mona's handwriting, sometimes underlined, sometimes pressed so hard it almost tore the page. I kept turning pages, trying to make sense of it. There were other words too, transferred, lost, and lists of dates that didn't match any holidays or birthdays I knew. There were newspaper clippings stuffed in the back, headlines about missing kids, families that disappeared, Amber Alerts. Some of the clippings had mugshots or school photos. At the bottom of almost every article, Mona had written wallpaper in the margin. It was the same handwriting as in the notebook, looping and sharp. I felt sick. I tried not to think about what that meant, but it was hard not to. I was still flipping through the notebook when I heard Maria banging on the basement door. Her voice was urgent, not loud, but enough to snap me out of whatever daze I'd fallen into. "Hurry up!" she hissed through the crack. I stuffed the notebook under my shirt, shoved the photos back into the drawer, and slammed it shut. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the wrench on the way up the stairs. I barely had time to lock the door behind me before Marco's truck pulled into the driveway. Maria looked at me with wide eyes but didn't say anything. I handed Mona the wrench, and she didn't even thank me. Just went back to fixing the sink with her jaw clenched tight. Marco stomped through the kitchen, keys jangling, and gave me a look that made my skin crawl. That night, after everyone went to bed, I lay awake listening to the house groan. Through the vent, I heard Marco's voice, loud and mean. I should have choked that kid right in her sleep that day. Mona didn't answer him. There was just the sound of someone crying. I pulled the notebook out from under my pillow and read through the names again, trying to memorize them. I wondered how many of them had slept in my room, how many had scratched their names into the dresser, how many had heard the same whispers through the walls. The next morning, Mona acted like nothing happened. She wore her yellow apron and made pancakes for everyone. Her hands shook as she set the plates down. She looked at me and Maria a little too long, her smile stretched thin. "Nobody talks about what's in the basement. Not ever," she said. Her eyes were red, like she hadn't slept. When the others left for school, I pulled Maria aside and handed her the notebook. She flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling. She stopped on a name and pressed her palm over it. I saw her lips start to tremble. It was her old foster sister, the one who vanished last year. Maria didn't cry loud, just small choked sounds she tried to hide. She said she remembered waking up and the bed was empty. No one ever talked about it. From then on, Mona and Marco watched us closer. Mona lingered in the hallway, pretending to tidy up, but really just listening. Marco kept his keys on his belt, jingling them every time he walked by. I started keeping the basement key hidden deep in my sock. Every sound in the house felt sharper, like the walls themselves were warning me. I stopped sleeping. Maria did too. We didn't talk about what we'd found, but we both knew. We waited for the right moment, but it never really felt safe. That's how things were at Mona's house. Even with the evidence in my hands, it felt like nobody would believe us if we tried to tell. The house pressed in closer every night, and the only thing left was to figure out how to get out. The night we tried to leave, the plan was as simple as it could be. Maria drew a map of the house in her notebook, marking out the doors and windows, but she always erased it right after, the bedside lamp flickering off and on as she worked. We hid a few crackers under the mattress just in case. We waited for Mona and Marco to start fighting, voices echoing through the thin walls, footsteps stomping from room to room. When it got loud enough, we slipped out into the hallway. We moved slowly, keeping close to the wall. The air felt thick, almost sticky. I could hear Maria's breath behind me, fast and shallow. We reached the stairs and I put my foot down as carefully as I could. That's when the floorboard gave a sharp, splitting creak. It was louder than anything else in the house. Marco's voice cut through the dark. "Who's down there?" His bed thudded against the wall, and I heard him stomping for the stairs. My heart jumped straight into my throat. Maria grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the front door, but Mona was already there, blocking the way. Her hair was loose and wild, her face pale in the hallway light. "Where do you think you're going?" she hissed. Marco came up behind us, his eyes wide and angry. Maria tried to distract him. She knocked over a lamp, making the bulb explode in a shower of sparks, and started yelling for help. I ducked under Mona's arm, scraping my elbow on the doorframe, and burst out into the yard. The air outside was cold and sharp. Gravel dug into my feet as I ran. I didn't look back. The neighbor's porch light was still on, and I pounded on their door until my fists hurt. When the man inside finally opened up, I could barely get the words out. "Please call the police." He stared at me for a second, then picked up his phone. The police cars showed up with lights spinning, painting the street red and blue. Mona and Marco stood on their porch, acting like nothing had happened. Mona wrapped herself in a sweater and started talking before the officers even got out of their cars. "They make things up. You know how foster kids are, always telling stories." She sounded calm, almost bored. I tried to explain, but my voice was shaking so much I could barely get the words out. The officers looked at me, then at Maria, then back at Mona and Marco. They split us up and asked questions. Where did we sleep? What did we see? Did anyone ever hurt us? It felt like the answers didn't matter. Marco sat at the kitchen table, arms folded, staring at the floor. When one of the officers asked him a question, he muttered, "I should have choked that kid in her sleep." The officer wrote it down, but I couldn't tell if it meant anything to him. I remembered the spiral-bound notebook I'd hidden in my jacket, the one with all the names, addresses, and clippings. I pulled it out and handed it to one of the officers. He flipped through the pages, then called his partner over. They both started reading, whispering to each other. One of them got on his radio. Pretty soon, more police showed up. They went upstairs and started peeling the wallpaper in Mona's room. I heard someone shout, and then the whole hallway filled with voices. People calling for more light, telling us to stay back. Nobody would let us see what was behind the wallpaper, but I could hear the way their voices changed, tight and scared. They brought the trunk up from the basement and opened it in the front yard. I didn't watch. I sat on the porch with my head in my hands, listening to the officers moving around inside. Maria sat next to me, not saying anything. After that, things moved fast. Mona and Marco were taken away in handcuffs. Mona tried to follow us to the car, but the officers held her back. Marco just shouted, "You don't know anything. You've got no proof." Nobody listened. The house was full of people. Police, caseworkers, neighbors peering in through the windows. Maria and I were put in different cars. I asked if we could stay together, but they said no. Something about paperwork. I watched her car pull away, her face pressed to the window, eyes wide and scared. I don't know where she went. I never saw her again. The new foster home was quiet. The windows were clean, the floors didn't creak, and nobody yelled at night. People told me I was lucky. They said I should be grateful. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the wallpaper in Mona's room, the colors, the seams, the way it peeled up at the edges. I couldn't stop thinking about what was hidden underneath. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and stare at the corners of my new bedroom, half expecting to hear a voice whispering through the wall. Now, every corner of my new bedroom reminds me that the worst lies behind closed doors. Sometimes you think you know who's in your house, and then you get someone like Luke. I don't mean bad, just off. Like he came with a little shadow that clung to him no matter how bright the room. Luke arrived in early spring, 7 years old, after his parents died in a plane crash. The agency said his uncle was overseas, so he'd be with me for a while. They described him as polite, quiet, no trouble at all. I'd heard that before. In foster care, quiet doesn't always mean safe. Sometimes it just means a kid is carrying something too heavy to talk about. When Luke stepped inside, he wore jeans that looked ironed and a green hoodie pilled with lint. He nodded at me, but kept his eyes fixed on the floor. I showed him his room, asked about allergies, told him when dinner was. He listened, but it was like he was waiting for some secret rule I hadn't explained. He never fussed, but each room felt colder when he walked through it. He did his homework, brushed his teeth, and put his plate in the sink. At night, I never heard him cry. Most kids do, at least a little, when they think nobody's listening. Luke just lay in bed, hands folded, eyes on the ceiling, as if he was waiting for something I couldn't see. The first week passed in a kind of uneasy quiet. Then I started hearing him talk to himself in his room. His door would be closed, but his voice carried into the hallway. One afternoon, I found him standing by the window, whispering into the glass. He said, "That's where Mama used to hang the wind chimes." He stared into the backyard like he expected to see them. I asked who he was talking to, and he said, "My mother." His voice was flat, like he was reading a grocery list. I thought maybe this was just grief. Kids sometimes talk to people they've lost, or keep up little rituals to make things feel less empty. I let it go at first. It got stranger after that. Luke would mention things that didn't belong to us, or to him. He asked if I remembered the white dog that slept by the radiator. I'd never had a dog. He talked about a song Mama played on the blue piano, but there wasn't a piano in the house. His drawings started showing rooms I'd never seen. A kitchen with blue striped wallpaper, a shed with shelves full of glass bottles, a swing hanging from an old elm. Sometimes he'd describe a street I didn't know, with a red brick school and a mail truck that drove by every day at 10. I checked, and most of those places were real, scattered across town, but I'd never been to any of them. One day, out of nowhere, Luke asked if I could take him to a blue house across town. He said, "It's important." When I told him I didn't know any blue house, he gave me the street name and house number, said it was half an hour away. He recited it like he'd lived there his whole life. I looked it up on Google Maps. Sure enough, there was a blue house with white trim and a barn-shaped mailbox right where he said. I thought about calling the agency, but what would I even say? Instead, I drove him there, thinking maybe seeing it would help him let go. When we pulled up, Luke stared at the house like he'd been holding his breath for years. He got out before I could stop him. The yard was tidy, the ground still soft from thawing mud. We walked up to the door, and before I could knock, an old woman opened it. Her hair was wild and white, and she wore a faded red apron. She looked at Luke, and her knees buckled. She caught herself on the doorframe and whispered, "Sam?" Then she started crying, deep and loud. "He died like a hero in the war," she said, her voice breaking. "Sam, is it really you? The 21st of December, do you remember?" Luke didn't even flinch. He smiled a little and said, "Hi, Mama. Did you make my favorite bread pudding?" The woman pulled him inside, holding his hand like she couldn't let go. I followed, not sure if I should interrupt. Everything felt slow, like the air was thicker in that house. Inside, Luke pointed at a chipped mug on the coffee table. "Did Dad still drink tea in the morning?" The old woman nodded. "He always makes too much." They sat together on a flowered couch, and Luke started talking about things no kid could know. He remembered where the Christmas stockings were hung in 1983. He asked about the loose step on the back porch. The woman told me, "My son died before this boy was born." But she looked at Luke like she was memorizing every detail of his face. I started writing things down. Luke would mention a yellow dog named Rusty. The woman brought out a faded photo of a retriever. He talked about thunderstorms and how she'd read to him, about sweaters he'd lost as a boy, about guitar lessons from Uncle Jimmy. Sometimes his voice sounded too old, like a grown man's, but then he'd slip back to being a quiet 7-year-old. The feeling never left the room. I called the agency, hoping they'd have some answer, but they just said, "Children are imaginative." That was all I got. It was like I was the only one who noticed anything strange. The old woman, though, wouldn't let go of Luke's hand. She was sure her son had come back. By summer, I felt like I was living in someone else's memory. Luke kept asking to visit the blue house. He'd sit with the old woman, ask about things from decades ago, and she'd answer through tears. The day she said, "He remembers everything. He's my Sam." I knew I'd never get a straight answer. Maybe trauma rewires a kid's brain. Maybe there are things you can't explain. Sometimes a child sits at your table and you realize they were never really yours. When Luke left that fall to live with a relative, I thought maybe the strangeness would leave with him. but some things stay behind, even after the doors close. I learned that not every horror is loud or violent. Sometimes it's just the feeling that you'll never really know who you're living with. I thought I'd seen the worst of it, but then Simon arrived, and everything changed again. Some kids turn up with a heaviness you can feel the second they walk in, and Simon was like that from the start. He arrived just before Halloween, thin and pale, his hair almost colorless, and his eyes always shifting away from mine. The agency told me he'd been moved around a lot, but that was all. They wouldn't hand over the thick file the caseworker carried, and she barely looked at Simon. He showed up with a plastic bag holding 3 shirts and a pair of shoes that didn't match in size. Later, I'd learn he'd already been with 2 foster families. Both ended with what the agency called accidents. Some people believed Simon was involved, but nobody wrote it down. Simon didn't talk much. He'd sit on the window seat in his room, pressed so close to the glass you could see where his forehead left a mark. If I asked what he wanted for breakfast, he wouldn't answer. Sometimes I'd hear him muttering when he thought I was gone, but if I came back, he'd just tap the window and go quiet again. The first days, I tried to give him space. He drifted from room to room in socks, moving so quietly I'd lose track of him. At dinner, he'd nod at the food but barely eat. I thought maybe drawing would help, so I left him colored pencils and paper. The first thing he handed me was a grocery list with a sentence scrawled across the back. "All my mommies are scared of me." He left it on the table and walked away. After that, I started watching him more closely. Carrie, one of the other kids, was the first to say something was wrong. She said Simon made her dream about being buried alive. She'd wake up with scratches on her arms, bright red and fresh, even though her nails were bitten down to nothing. I told myself she must have scratched herself in her sleep. That's what you do when you want to believe things are normal. But even the dog stayed out of Simon's room after the first week. I asked the agency again about Simon's past, and all I got was, "Give him time." They sounded tired. I tried to believe them. Still, the house felt different. Simon would sit in the living room, unmoving, staring out the window. Sometimes he'd whisper to himself, lips barely moving, and the words would slip away before I could catch them. The house felt smaller, colder, like it was holding its breath. Carrie's nightmares got worse. She told me Simon stood beside her bed at night, just watching. I never saw it, but one morning she woke up screaming, 3 scratches running down her back. After that, she refused to sleep alone. Some mornings, I'd hear Simon say things under his breath. Once it was, "They're all going away soon." I acted like I didn't hear. If I asked Simon what he wanted, he'd just smile that empty little smile and say nothing. If I asked what he missed, he said, "My other homes." There was never any sadness in his voice, just a blank space. One afternoon while cleaning, I found old newspaper clippings folded into Simon's backpack. The first was about a fire that killed a family of 4. Another was about a car accident. A third was a gas leak in a trailer that killed 2 adults and a child. Each story mentioned foster care. When I asked why he kept them, Simon shrugged and said, "I like reading about families." Meals, games, therapy. Nothing broke through to him. The only time he let anything slip was the night Carrie screamed in the hallway. I ran out and found Simon standing over her, his hands tight around her throat. When I tried to pull him off, he spun toward me and said, "Don't try to come closer or I'll cut her open." His voice was flat, no emotion at all. I managed to grab him and get Carrie away, but Simon just looked at me like nothing had happened. "They never believe you," he said. I called the police. They came, but there wasn't enough proof for anything except a warning about supervision. After that, Simon's drawings changed. He filled pages with black rectangles, bodies in graves, faces with no eyes. Every night before bed he'd say, "I miss my other homes." Sometimes I'd find him in the kitchen at 3 a.m, standing in the dark, staring into nothing. The house felt smaller, the air heavier. I started sleeping with the hall light on and kept Carrie close to me at all times. A week later, before the sun came up, Simon walked into the kitchen and sat at the table. He looked at me and said, "I burned the house down while they slept." I still recall their screams and cherish those memories. He said it like he was talking about the weather. I realized I didn't know who or what I'd let into my home. I called the agency and demanded answers. That's when they told me about the 2 prior families. Both had suffered accidents. Some believed Simon was involved, but nothing was ever proven. The caseworker's voice was careful, like she was reading from a script. Nobody wanted to say it out loud. After that, I stopped sleeping. I kept Carrie close, never let her out of my sight. I counted every day until Simon's transfer was approved. When the van finally came, Simon just got in, hugged the caseworker, and waved goodbye like he was going to camp. He didn't look back. I stopped taking in foster kids. Simon was the last one I ever cared for. Even now, I can't walk through my house at night without checking every lock and listening for the sound of small feet in the hallway. There are things you never really leave behind, no matter how quiet the house gets. In these foster homes, the very places meant to be safe hid the deadliest secrets. After Mona, Luke, and Simon, I learned that no lock, no wallpaper pattern can guarantee you're safe. The ordinary can be where the worst things nest, and I can't walk into a quiet house or trust a gentle smile the way I used to. If you found these stories unsettling, share your thoughts below. Sometimes talking it through is the only way to keep fear from taking root. Next, we'll explore what happens when the past refuses to stay buried.